Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to the Art of Procurement Friday show. So for those of you that know me well, you know that my family were just so lucky to welcome a baby boy into the world this week. So baby Aiden was born last Wednesday as we record this, and he joins his brother Tristan in certainly being the kings of the castle in our household. So I'm kind of using that as an excuse, I think, for coming into this week's show without much of a subject planned for the Art of Procurement Friday show. And that's why this week's episode may be a little shorter. But today's subject, when I was thinking of what to talk about today, I was looking at things that are really near and dear to my heart, things that I'm really passionate about. And one of those is the RFP. And, are we abusing what is and can be a useful tool? Do we use it too much in procurement? So that's something that I wanted just to explore today. I've been on both sides of the table. I've both written and I've responded to RFPs as a buyer and a service provider. So my perspective is really shaped from that experience, again, on both sides of the table. Before I do go into the show today, I want to remind you that I recently published a report called the 21 Tips to help you secure your dream procurement job. The report is a summary of tips and tricks that cover the entire job search process, just compiled from recent Art of Procurement interviews. I've been really fortunate that the report's been a hit so far. If you haven't had a chance to download it yet, then just go to artofprocurement.com/21tips. That's artofprocurement.com/21tips. Okay, well, let's go straight into the show. And first of all, I wanted to talk terminology. So I do find that RFQs and RFPs, they tend to be used interchangeably. But I thought up front it was just important to say that, they aren't one and the same. And when I was doing a little research prior to recording today, I came across an interesting article on DeltaBid's website, and they discuss the difference between both. So what I'm going to do is I will link to that in the show notes today. To give a very quick overview and summary of the difference, well, an RFQ, and Q being for quote, is typically used when you have a specification that you want to buy against, and an RFP, so P being for proposal, is used when you have a problem that you want to solve, but you're not necessarily sure on exactly how to go about solving it. In an RFQ, you know what you want. The RFQ leaves little room for the responders to be creative in responses. And a buyer typically already has pre-qualified the suppliers, so price is really the main decision point. And just to kind of go on an RFQ, in episode 18 last week, we talked with the co-founders of Market Dojo with regards to e-auctions. And an e-auction is really a good way of managing an RFQ event, as long as you have a good number of participants to involve in that event. But that's a good example of an RFQ, obviously Q being for quote. And an RFP, so the request for proposal, as I briefly mentioned, you have an idea of what you want, you have a problem that you know you need to solve, but you're not entirely sure on how you go about solving it. So you would reach out to the market to ask for proposals on how to solve your problem. My concern is that RFPs are really overused by procurement, and they're typically sent to many participants at the same time at the beginning of a sourcing event. As a buyer, I found that the RFP was my primary tool in understanding the marketplace. So I think that's particularly the case when I was early in my career. And, those times I was more of a journalist than a specialist. So in issuing an RFP, it saved me a lot of time, and that was really important to me because I had a busy schedule, as I expect you do. And so I didn't have to go and research the market too much when I was buying something I wasn't 100% in the know of the nuances and the ins and outs of buying that product or that service. So I could basically ask the suppliers to do my research for me, to give me answers to all the questions I had. And so I didn't have to worry about digging too deep into research for a particular marketplace. But here's the rub. I found out that I would send the RFP to companies that I knew had little chance of winning the business. It really wasn't unusual for my stakeholders to have decided a short list of who they wanted to award the business to, And so the RFP came a way for me to kind of validate what those chosen shortlisted suppliers were saying against the market, just to give me a good feel that we weren't going to be taken advantage of when we selected really one of the two suppliers that we already had in mind for the business. The other thing to say is that I think that when sending an RFP, I felt that whoever I sent it to would respond in the best way possible because I had leverage. And, I say that having worked for big companies, had a lot of money to spend. And I think that, when I went out to market, the brand that I was representing was enough for me to get what information I needed out of suppliers by using an RFP. My experience since then, and obviously I've matured and kind of looked at the use of RFPs differently as I became further into my career. But when I started managing teams, I felt that that is really still the primary way in which RFPs are used today, the primary reason RFPs are used. When I flip to the other side as a service provider, responding to an RFP, it's a really time-intensive activity. And, it often use and often require really high-value resources that you'll be pulling away from billable activities. So every time I looked at an RFP that I received, I would think about a few different things. I would think, does the potential client fit in my target demographic? How realistic are my chances of succeeding with the RFP? Or am I just there to provide free consulting? I would consider if I had a chance to influence the scope, or is it really being dictated to me? Something that's really important is, how committed does the potential client seem to be to drive the change that I would need to be successful if I won the business? And that's important as you start getting into backwards and forwards with the buyer. And finally, is it really, am I getting all the information that's available, which really helps me respond in the best way possible, or do I feel that information's being kept from me? And that last point, I think, is one that actually was reiterated if you go all the way back to episode 4, when I talked with Tibor Shanto, and we discussed the sales view of procurement and how procurement and sales can work together. One of the big problems that he talked about from a sales perspective is always feeling that maybe in an RFP process, procurement was holding back information so that you weren't completing an RFP with all possible information available to you. My point is that as a buyer, I think naively I felt that just sending the RFP guaranteed that everybody I sent it to would put their best foot forward, whereas as a seller, I felt that if the buyer was acting in this way, I would respond, let's say, the most cost-effective way. So I would try not to invest too much time in developing a proposal that might have been what the buyer needed. I would focus more on just trying to provide enough information which hopefully got me to the next round so that I could figure out how serious the buyer really was. And as a buyer, and obviously I wouldn't really realize this because I wouldn't be an expert in that particular market that we were going to try and buy a product or service in, I'd receive a bunch of half-hearted responses rather than proposals to solve the challenge I had in the most innovative way. I would be looking at those proposals and the responses that I got as the best that those providers could put forward, not really, as I say, a bunch of half-hearted responses. So what's the solution? I don't think that there's a silver bullet, but, most obviously, I think it's to understand the marketplace for the service you're buying as much as you can, so that when you know which suppliers to target, you can go to them in advance rather than taking what I found that I do and what I see a lot of RFPs doing is more of a spray and pray approach. For those where it's an absolute requirement that you have to send a number of RFPs just because there's a policy, procedure, regulatory requirement in place, be as transparent as you can, provide as much information as you can. Try and limit the number of questions in the RFP and write it in a way that doesn't require a big investment of time on behalf of the respondents. Thinking of it in just trying not to make it a burden to respond to the RFP. For a slightly different approach, consider what Bob Rodwell talked about in episode 16. And what Bob was talking about was in reference to selecting marketing agencies, but I think it's really highly relevant to all categories. And Bob suggested that once you know the main players in the market, conduct an informal RFI first, and that can take the form of 30-minute to an hour interviews with a larger number of potential suppliers, and you do that to get a better feel for their culture, to kind of understand how they approach problems, understand what solutions they bring to market, and just get a little bit of a first impression of their capability. In advance of that, you can issue a project brief just so they know the context. But I find that this really significantly reduces the upfront investment of time that you have in both building the RFP and sending it out, but also for the supplier and responding, especially when a lot of the RFPs that are issued are done so with, you never have even talked to the recipients about the project in advance. Once you've done these interviews, then use the information you gather to create your shortlist. At this point, you can issue a much shortened, truncated RFP to just those suppliers who you think would be a great fit. You can keep it concise and just focus on proposed solution along with pricing rather than, all the little bits and pieces that you often ask for that turn an RFP into asking for a pricing and proposal into asking for 100 questions, responses to 100 questions. You can then use that response as the focus on final presentations and negotiations. I find that this saves time on all sides. Respondents will know that when they're being shortlisted, they've already got a good chance of being awarded the business, or at least much greater chance of being awarded the business than just sending out an RFP to multiple participants. They'll see a much bigger ROI or potential ROI of participating, and so you're more likely to get, their best, their finest work when they respond to the RFP rather than something that I said before was a little bit more half-hearted. What I don't want to do is suggest that that's the only solution. What I did want to do with today's show is really just to stop and think about how you use an RFP. Are you using it to gather as much market intelligence as possible? Or are they a way of learning more about the capabilities and solutions that your pre-vetted service providers, those that have a strong chance of winning the business, can provide to you? If it's the former, then maybe you want to think differently about how you lever RFPs. But if it's the latter, then I think that's fantastic. You're already on the way to using an RFP in a way that increases the chances of really successfully finding the solution and the service provider that exactly meets what you need and meets what you need over the long term. Okay, well, that's a wrap for today's show. What I would love is if, what are your thoughts on using RFPs? Am I being unrealistic, or do you think that as a profession we do abuse the RFP process? I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can respond on Twitter or in the comments to the show, which are at the show notes. You'll find those at artofprocurement.com/21. That's artofprocurement.com/21. All right, well, I hope that you have a great weekend, and I'll have another fantastic interview show ready to go on Tuesday, so I look forward to talking to you then. All right, thank you, and take care.